Faculty members, and I'm new to leadership studies. I'm just got my learner's permit, actually. And I now understand after this morning why Joanne has been so buoyant at the prospect of assembling this group. It has been a joy to be here. We few we happy few, yeah. You've had leadership ethics, and you've had followership. We'll have justice, we'll have politics, we'll have groups, and this is the everything else group. Literature, history, and religion. We are just about everything else, the three of us. I've been known to poach in historical studies and in literature, but I'm going to confine myself today to religious studies. I came from a position where I shared an appointment in history and religious studies about 4.5 years ago. I was asked about that time to propose an elective course by the dean, the Associate Dean Terry Price. In trying to think what might be relevant for leadership studies, I proposed a course on the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and the rise of the Universal Church. The fall of the Universal Empire, rise of the Universal Church. Dean Price, knowing full well that he had a new colleague with no track record and a new course with no track record, suggested a different title, one that would draw the Jepson students, so the course became Emperors, Bishops, Martyrs, Sex, Power, Love, Lust, Longing, and Leadership in late antiquity. But I have had tremendous fun, and now know in this room that I'm not at all outnumbered with Rich and with Jack, wherever Jack is. We'll be talking when we get tomorrow about a very exciting contribution that does yoke religious studies and leadership studies. It does much of my work, actually. The difficulty with teaching that course was that I still hadn't quite caught the mood at Jepson, and about 4 weeks into that course on late antiquity, when I was discussing and the students were reading several sermons that had been written on the occasion of 410, the sack of Rome, the great laments of Augustine and Jerome, on what was considered a terrible tragedy. The empire only 100 years before had officially recognized Christianity when the emperor was converted, nominally perhaps, to Christianity. And then the empire deteriorated quite rapidly and fell apart. It's like buying a used Saab, I suppose, and not getting more than a few thousand miles out of it. But the Christian community was terribly disappointed in what God had done. Had God done something to entice the Christians into politics and then collapse the world around them? If God was all-powerful and all-loving and benevolently disposed, why would Rome fall so soon after accepting Christianity? Midway through the discussion, one student, terribly finally shared her frustration with us all and asked, "What does this have to do with leadership studies?" I learned at that point to flip at Jepson. I said, "We're dealing with God, the leader of leaders." In Rate Your Professor, you can still find that student's comment, endorsed by others. In order to succeed in Kaufman's course, you had to believe in God fervently. Ever since that time, as the dean will attest, I have done my best at becoming the most irreverent faculty member at Jepson. And if you didn't hear that, she said, he succeeds. It's good, I've marked that down. This semester, I am daring to go once again in an elective devoted completely to Augustine, and I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that before I wrap up. The role of religious studies and historical studies in the history of religion, in this case, the Judeo-Christian religion, at Jepson is, to my mind, to use the past in order to get the students to think critically about the present. My comment earlier about being bifocal, to encourage them, to encourage intellectual agility and capacious compassion, to get them out of their skin into different cultures, into different times. In Augustine, there's plenty to talk about. I could have jumped into the City of God, which is political theory or political theology, which gives you a variety of alternative ways of thinking about participating as a leader in the state. I could and will discuss Augustine's career as a leader in the church, essentially defining the way mainstream Christianity comports itself when challenged by a variety of heretical notions. But instead I decided to start with Augustine's Confessions. Some of you may know it. It appears in core courses and psychology courses and humanities courses. It's his spiritual autobiography. And while I try not to dwell too much on context, I do encourage the students, when they read Book 1 and 2, to think as Augustine might have thought, the Stoics might have thought, the Neoplatonists might have thought about evil. Most students in leadership studies think of evil as something that will appear, need not have a definition, but can be easily recognized, whereas Augustine is so passionate about coming to terms with what evil is, whether it is an inordinate attachment to ephemeral things, to things that don't matter as much as those that should, or whether evil is malevolence. Some of you may recall the episode in Book 2 of the Confessions where he steals pears, not because he wants them, not because he's hungry, but just to deprive the orchard's owner. To spend so much time in getting a framework to define evil may seem, for a 19 or 20-year-old, 21-year-old, a waste of time, because they think evil can be, or wickedness can be defined situationally. And we try to encourage them, even before they get to the capstone course in ethics, to think a little more seriously about the genre of wickedness. Book 3 through 5 came to mind when Professor Kelly was talking about his skepticism with reference to charismatic leadership. It is at the point that Augustine talks about what drew him to the Manichaeans, the Manichaean specialists, the elite, the charismatic leaders, and what then drove him away. The importance of charisma and the perils of charisma came home to me when I was co-editing a special issue on charisma, and had mentioned that to Jess Flanagan, one of my colleagues, and she responded passionately and spontaneously, "I hate charisma," she said. And nobody had talked about hating charisma, and Professor Kelly, I don't think, he's somewhere out there, wasn't quite couched it a little more ambiguously, but it does give the students a chance to talk about charismatic leadership. Augustine found charismatic leadership not much at all to his taste. He preferred his charismatics to be dead, the saints and martyrs, so that he could tell tales about them rather than to sit at their feet. I think books 6 through 8 are excellent to compare leadership styles, because this is where Augustine came into contact with Bishop Ambrose of Milan, a very much in-your-face leader, as some of you may know, knowing the tradition. For those of you who don't, I've just put Van Dyck's. It was historically inaccurate, to be sure, but it became a powerful image of Bishop Ambrose of Milan, forbidding entry to the temple, the church, to Emperor Theodosius. It was, as I said, profoundly influential in the medieval period when the popes were jockeying with the various barons, kings, and emperors of Europe. I also put it in front of you because, if I may indulge in a bit of allegory, I have you look once again at my colleague Don over there. You'll see that Theodosius uncannily resembles Don. So I tend to think of it as the humanities forbidding the social sciences entry into the temple of learning. But be that as it may, we can talk about, in talking about Augustine, we can talk about the role of the NGOs, or the crypto-governmental operations, as the church was, arguably, or the semi-governmental organizations, in working alongside, but also as a counterculture for the state. And finally, in books 9 and 11, Augustine has a profound, but alas, a rather inaccessible discussion of memory and how important memory is. And our students tend to forget that memory plays an important part. Managing memory, or manipulating memory, plays an important part in leadership and its leaders' successes or failures. Now, I learn as much from my students' perceptions, but only by having them dock them alongside of Augustine's. Finally, since I'm in the confessional mode, I'll frame my confession. Having been here at Jepson and in this room this morning, I have to say that though I've been a part of 8 faculties, I counted them 8 department faculties, and I guess I'm now a part of a school faculty. I have never met a group of more prolific and personable colleagues, discerning and dedicated and damnably smart pedagogues, as I find those who are engaged in multidisciplinary work in defining and refining our students' understanding of and capacity for leadership. Well, amen to that. Amen to that. Now, the last thing I want to say is a plug for the 21st Issues Forum. This is the 20th anniversary. I want you to think back about your 20th birthday. Did any of you remember your 20th birthday? But I'll bet few of you have forgotten your 21st birthday. The 21st birthday is when you really came of age. And the 21st, Kristin, who's going to speak next, and we've gathered a number of colleagues together to help define something that we're quite groping for ourselves, called cultural leadership. So we invite you back. We want you to pay attention to the literature. It will be cast over quite an extended period, the whole year. We'll be talking about whether there is such a thing as cultural leadership, what it is, and how to inspire it in our students. So do return.
I'm guessing that means it's my turn. Like Peter, I ran into a small problem my first semester of teaching my home discipline to leadership studies students, and that problem would be, what does this, and in my case that was theater and film, have to do with leadership studies? Therefore, I want to talk about how literature serves leadership studies and how it can serve leadership studies in both theory and in practice. This past fall, I and my junior and senior Jepson students and Dr. Kirsten Soderlund undertook something that we came to call the Jepson Shakespeare Project. The idea for this project came from a combination of my background in theater tech and children's theater and my admiration for a program called Shakespeare Behind Bars. Kurt Toffland, its founder and artistic director, began the program at Luther Luckett Correctional Facility in Kentucky, using an annual production of a Shakespeare play as a rehabilitatory experience designed to, quote, offer participants the ability to hope and the courage to act, despite their fear and the odds against them, and to transform inmate offenders from who they were when they committed their crimes to who they are in the present moment, to who they wish to become. In a recent article, Kaufman explains how Shakespeare helps inmates achieve these goals in the program. He says, "I use theater techniques to train the inmate offender to analyze the nuances of a fictional dramatic character's interior world that prompt the character's external behavior. Through this process, the inmate gains insights and the skills required to apply the same process to his own life." I recently had the opportunity to interview Kaufman on what led him to Shakespeare Behind Bars. He had been working with students in junior high and high school classrooms and found that there were some that were missing on the days that he came in. He learned that the problem students, so-called, were being kept in study hall so that they did not disrupt his visits. He asked to have them brought into the classroom and found that many of these problem students were the ones who excelled the most in theater and arts. He attributed this to their different learning styles, citing Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligence. Soon he began working with only the problem students, and the jump to working in the prison system that already incorporated a literature program was a natural transition. When I designed the course Leadership on Stage and Screen here at Jepson, I immediately thought of Shakespeare Behind Bars. In 2003, Philomath Films made a documentary, also titled Shakespeare Behind Bars, that focused on that year's production of The Tempest. At the start of this past fall, my class watched the documentary and discussed how the program made use of Shakespeare to enact change in the inmates. We then read The Tempest itself, and were able to look at the differences between what Shakespeare probably intended in 1611 and the way the inmates in 2003 chose to interpret that. To further emphasize the difference between contextual and hermeneutic approaches, we watched Julie Taymor's 2011 version of The Tempest, starring Helen Mirren as Prospera instead of Prospero. And finally, in order to look at the ways in which theater could be a political act, we read Amy Césaire's A Tempest, a 20th century adaptation of the play designed to promote civil rights in Martinique. The point of all of these versions was not only to explain that there are many possible ways to interpret and stage a production, but to show that theater can function to promote questions of egalitarianism and social justice. From there, I turned things over to them. In 5 groups of 3 to 4 students, they edited and cut each act of the play, discussed what they wanted to accomplish through the staging of that act, and planned how they were going to make it accessible and intelligible to children from ages 9 to 14. Each group met with a different partner organization and worked on a different act of the play. They were meant to rehearse with their group once a week for 7 weeks for 60 to 90 minutes each week. And at the end of those 7 weeks, we were going to put on a stage reading with props and costumes performed in a real theater on the university campus. My students, understandably so, harbored a lot of trepidation about the project, but what they lacked in theatrical training, they made up for, with hard work and an education in the theories and models of group dynamics, organizational leadership, and social justice. I think in many ways having leadership studies students rather than lit students is what made the project actually work as well as it did. Neither my students nor the kids they worked with had any sort of baggage about Shakespeare, although they did have a lot of reservations about their ability to actually teach it. This lack of experience, though, is one of the things that Hal Cobb, who is an inmate at Luther Luckett and who has been with Shakespeare Behind Bars for 18 years, says makes the project successful. He writes, "They have no preconceived notions of what it should or should not be. They don't get caught up in iambic pentameter or academic debates. Their reactions are pure, unbiased, and visceral." And this was definitely the case for us. The Jepson students who directed Act 5, for instance, wrote in their paper about the experience of introducing the kids to Shakespeare. One of the first questions we posed to the children was, "Who is Shakespeare?" The responses were quite startling, especially since we had already read some form of Shakespeare prior to high school. Responses ranged from, "That really rich guy," to "Some dude from Italy who studied English in college." However, my students also expressed surprise at the ease with which the kids were nevertheless able to pick up the iambic pentameter and understand the plot and characters. Act 2 wrote in their paper that after meeting first with the kids, it was clear that we had highly underestimated their abilities. Jen, one of my students, wrote on her blog that not only did these kids have almost no trouble reading the script, there were only a couple of words they mispronounced, but they understood the plot and what the characters were like. Another student, Hannah, said that even though they're new to it, the kids are already beginning to understand what the act is about. On the day of performance, after 5 weeks of prep work with me and 7-ish weeks of rehearsal, they got interrupted by school vacations, several events including a carnival and one hurricane. The appointed day finally arrived. After the buses dropped off all the actors, there was a bit of running around, as you would expect, but the kids were really interested in the hows and whys of the production, and they began to learn where we had put their props, worked on sound checks, and started focusing as the Jepson students began to run read-throughs, conduct warm-up games, and talk about how they were going to have to act differently on stage than they had in their classrooms. When the show began, much to my surprise, it was as calm and smoothly orchestrated as any tech director ever could have asked. Especially given that they'd never actually run it from the start to the finish. My tech crew was the Act 3 students whose group had backed out at the last minute, and several kids and Jepson students were playing roles they had never read. But they enjoyed it, and even better, so did their parents and the teachers in the audience. In the aftermath, my students gathered and were waiting their promised free pizza dinner, and one of them said, "You know, I hated this project from the beginning, but it was totally worth it." Act 4 wrote in their paper that even with the issues we had, the final performance went so much better around than we expected. Seeing the kids genuinely so excited for the performance made everything worth it. After they turned in their papers, in which they had to analyze the act, the process of directing, the leadership dynamics of their group, the kids, and the interorganizational process, and finally had to make suggestions for how I might fix this project in the future, I found that that was the most valuable part of the whole thing. They had learned from the kids as they were trying to teach them, and they had realized that they learned something about how literature and theater could actually engage in leadership. What they found is that drama is just as complex as any other organizational endeavor. They had to rely on each other, rely on the kids, and had to trust me to literally not turn the lights out on them, which I accidentally did once in Act 2 backstage. They had to grapple with what they thought about Shakespeare, but also what they thought their goals were for the production, and then they had to adjust them to match the somewhat competing goals of the children, including Act 1, who informed their group that Caliban should not be a slave, slaves are bad, we're going to make him a butler. In the portion of the paper where I asked my students to reflect on the leadership dynamics, I noticed that they actually invoked the same theories that Toftland explained. Act 1 talked about Gardner's multiple intelligences. They focused on interpersonal and intrapersonal, specifically. And Act 5 described their actors' interactions in terms of the Big Five personality and implicit leadership models, all without any coaching from me. Act 2 finally noted, "We found the kids were emerging as leaders for the show and for each other, and we were just facilitators." So ultimately, the project was enormously successful, not only from a pedagogical point of view, but from the simple fact that it offered a multiplicity of opportunities for both the kids, who had never read Shakespeare before, and my students. The kids were able to experience the arts and Shakespeare, things not in their curriculum, and my students gave Shakespeare and literature in general a context that for them was practical and socially relevant, and finally meant something to them. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here. This is a wonderful event. I've greatly enjoyed the comments. Let's see. All right. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Excellent. Great. When we install individuals as leaders, when we say, oh, you're the leader, you've got this position now, we give them the keys to the kingdom. And I guess centuries ago, probably, that was probably literally true. People would get a bunch of keys to the gates of cities, and here you go, here are the keys. And we don't have those kinds of gates anymore, but I think it's still figuratively true. The keys to the kingdom that leaders get is the power to ask questions, the power to ask any question of anybody at any time with the expectation they'll get an answer. And if you think about it, that is a precious power. I'm a school board member, and one of the things that I see is that there's a rule on the books that members of the public can come to school board meetings and ask questions. I also see that the experienced bureaucrats there often deflect the answers, ignore the answers, can kind of brush the answers away, and if the citizen persisted and said you didn't answer the question, it would sort of be violating norms, right? So there's, to some extent, there's a show of questioning, which happens, and indeed sometimes questions get honestly answered. It's not like they never get answered, but if a particular bureaucrat doesn't want to answer a question, or if discussion goes on, there's lots of questions that get asked by citizens all the time that never get answered. So I want to start with that point about leaders, that they're the ones who get to ask questions and demand answers, and there's really no limit on the kinds of questions that they can ask. I think that tells us something really important about the deepest nature of leadership. I think it's about asking those questions. Questions about the community that you're presuming to lead. And I think, we spend a lot of time talking about influence processes, the activities of leadership, effective leadership, delivering the goods, Gene Lippenblumen brought in from Peter Drucker. And all that's real and it's good, but none of those are the starting point. The starting point are the questions that directed us towards a certain goal, that directed us to choose a certain way of getting towards that goal. It's the asking of questions about the group, its purpose, its modes of operation, the identity of its members, the nature of its competitive environment, where it is, its condition, the nature of allegiance of individuals to the group. Those are the questions that leaders wrestle with. In some ways, this is very easy to see. And in some ways, when we study literature, history, biography studies, we can see questions explicitly coming to the fore. At other times, the questions are not so easy to see, because at the same time that the questions are at the heart, that's not really what we want from leaders. If we go to the follower notion, what do followers want? Followers want guidance. Followers want to know in what direction to go. Followers don't necessarily want to be engaged in a colloquium of questions about who are we really? What are we trying to do? That might work as an exercise, but fairly quickly, followers, not because they're stupider or lazier, they've got their own work to do, right? They got a lot, as followers, we all know, as members of an organization, there's a lot of work that we have to do. And to some extent, it simplifies our lives. It makes our work easier, more manageable, if at a certain point we're told in what direction to go or what to go do. So that's part of what we expect from leaders, is the answers to the questions. Questions that generate answers that translate into actions. That's a very complicated linkage. But again, the point is, it started with questions. It started with the philosopher. And I think a lot about Plato and Plato's Republic and this elaborate scheme for the education of, well, what were they, Joanna? Philosopher kings, right? They were people who were really good. What were they really, really good at? The dialectic, asking questions. Now, they were good at a lot of other stuff too. And in that book, Plato is really scared of the power of the dialectic. And there's a ruthless winnowing that occurs at multiple stages in the education of young future leaders. And the ones who are not loyal enough, the ones who are not selfless enough, the ones who show signs of being corrupted, they get cast aside, right? So the system does all it can to generate pure, incorruptible leaders who will ask out of the goodness of their heart and seek answers that are for the good of the group, not for the good of the game, because not for their good. Because of course, if you're the one person who can ask and get the answer to any question, it's an incredible power. It's an incredible power. It's a very corrupting power. As I say, leaders ask questions, but that's not the only thing we want from them. We want actions and outcomes. So at a certain point, leaders draw the veil over the question, or we ask them to. So lots of leadership work goes into concealing the questions, keeping the questions hidden. And that's especially the case if the answers to the questions have not been re-examined in a long time. Sometimes leaders asking questions generate new or different answers, but sometimes they generate reaffirmations of the same old answers. And in those cases, it might be better not to really make it clear that there was a question asked at all. But the questions are so dangerous. And again, thinking about the discussion on followership, to the extent that any one of us can ask, any one of us can participate in leadership. There's this electric moment, one of my favorite Shakespeare moments in Henry V. Many people see Henry V as sort of this positive portrayal of a charismatic king. It's probably about as positive a story of leadership as Shakespeare has. I guess there's not a lot of positive depictions of leadership in Shakespeare overall. But it's not really that positive. It doesn't take a lot of sifting to see that. And there's just the whole war in France is predicated on bad faith. And it's also a project that at the end you realize it didn't work, right? So it's a wonderfully charismatic portrayal of a failed bad faith effort. It's kind of astounding, right? So it's the night before the big battle, and Henry is walking around. Psychologically, he's trying to make people feel better, right? The soldiers. And there's this wonderful contrast between the French aristocrats who are just sitting talking with each other about their horses and their armor. Well, he's out talking to the men. It's very great, very appealing. Ideologically, he's trying to suggest that his war is just, even though Shakespeare in Act 1, Scene 1 worked pretty hard to show us that this is a bad faith war. So Henry's doing this, he's winning people over, he comes across a guy named Williams, and he says, you can trust the king, he'll be with you, and Williams asks questions. How do you know? How do you know what the king will do? Isn't he going to do what all the kings do? Oh my gosh, it's an electric moment. That Williams scene, it just turns the whole play upside down. And Henry never really has an answer for the guy. The scene sort of ends eventually by virtue of his status. Henry is able to overmaster Williams in his questions. But boy, that moment of electric truth-seeking, that's why Shakespeare is such a great person to read for leadership studies. Those kinds of moments pepper lots of great literature. The book of Job. Job asks these great questions. And God never really has an answer for him. Why are you suffering? God eventually just gets irritated and says, stop asking questions. Did you raise up Leviathan? Is your arm so mighty? He rebuts him, not with logic, but with his own questions. And tellingly, at the end of Job, Job never speaks again. He's been bludgeoned into silence. But that's not what always happens. Sometimes the questions can tame and domesticate leaders. And I'll close with just a quick comment on Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh starts out a monstrous leader, taller, bigger, more physically dominant, with no sense of nurturing for his people. He has sex with the women or the men. He does whatever he wants. He's a big, strong guy, so he sort of protects him from the outside world. But he's absolutely brutal and rapacious. The people ask heaven for relief, and heaven makes Gilgamesh a friend. And that seems to tame him. He goes from brutal egotism to friendship. It's a step in the direction of humanization of this man. But his friend dies. And that's when the story really gets interesting. Gilgamesh is confronted by the realization that he may die too and will die too. And he goes off on a quest. He goes off on a quest to answer a question. How can I live forever? The story seems to end in failure because he visits a bunch of people, learns a bunch of stuff, gets this magic plant, but loses it instantly, and he comes back to his city. But the story does not end in failure because as he comes back, he sees his city, the city that he's been the ruler of, and his relationship to it now is different. And we realize that there is an answer to the question, how even the most brutal and dominant of leaders can live forever through his city. The city will live forever if he takes care of it and nurtures it. And it's about the most positive story about questions that I know of. And it's so interesting that it's one of our very first leadership stories. That Gilgamesh comes back quiet, no speeches, doesn't really talk to people, just sees the city. He sees the orchards, the settled grounds, the walls, and his relationship to his charge, to his community, has changed, I think, through the power of seeking for answers to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I certainly don't have to make a case for questions now, do I? I do want to encourage a number of my colleagues whom I know, and many of you I don't know, who use the humanities, literature, history, religious studies in your teaching or commenting on literature. Thad, who uses them prolifically and has written on Plato. Joanne, who spends a lot of her time in classical antiquity. Gary, who I think has taught an entire course on Thucydides, repeatedly. So those of you at Jepson and elsewhere who use the humanities, please feel free to comment and address the questions as we will. Questions? Yes.
I've been running back and forth to classes, so I've missed most of the sessions, so I'm not sure exactly what the drill is in terms of running them. But I wasn't here. I was here for when Terry kicked off, and I'm going to do the same as Terry in two respects. One is I'm going to read what I have to say, so I'll stay within the 10 minutes. I'm not used to doing this, but I'm going to, and then I'm not going to introduce the other speakers who will go in an order to be named later. I have been doing work with my colleague in the psychology department, Scott Allison, on heroes, and now heroic leadership, and I'd like to thank Georgia Sorenson and Ron Riggio for including our new book in their series, and also thanks to Peter Kaufman, editor of a special issue of Religions, for encouraging me to think about what I'm going to read to you. First, the link between heroism and leadership, to be discussed later. In 1902, Charles Horton Cooley, famous sociologist, social psychologist, in his chapter on leadership or personal ascendancy begins, but how do we choose our heroes? What is it that gives leadership to some and denies it to others? So the view that leadership and heroism are the same thing has been around in the sociology literature for over 110 years. Is this good news or bad news for Scott and me? I don't know. But we'll be thinking about the relationship between the two. In the recent film Hyde Park on Hudson, Laura Linney portrays Franklin D. Roosevelt's distant cousin and confidant, Daisy Suckley. The film, based in part on Suckley's recently discovered diaries, has her suggesting that the press, the public, and FDR himself all worked for their own reasons to maintain the heroic, charismatic image of Roosevelt that seemed so important to the nation's psyche in mid-1939. For example, photographers generally cooperated in not taking pictures of Roosevelt being transferred bodily from his wheelchair to his car. People knew he had polio, but all parties preferred pictures of FDR that showed him looking confident and powerful. Human beings have a need for heroes and strong charismatic leadership. They construct charismatic representations of individual leaders that allow them to develop and maintain heroic images. Like FDR, leaders are often active participants in what we might call leadership theater, designed to give followers what they wish for. John Keegan puts it well: the theatrical impulse will be strong in the successful politician and will be both expected and reinforced by the audiences to which they perform. The leader of men can show himself to his followers only through a mask that he must make for himself, but a mask made in such form as will mark him to men of his time and place as the leader they want and need. I want to consider the joint construction of an heroic image by Abraham Lincoln and his audiences or followers during the time he lived and into the present. The cognitive work that people did to create a charismatic perception of Lincoln in his time is nicely described by Shelby Foote in his Civil War Narrative History, Volume 1. Foote argued that Lincoln made himself unusually available to the public, and that as more and more people saw him or heard from others who had, they liked what they saw or heard. Foote explains, he received all comers, and for the most part received them with a sympathy which by their own admission equaled or succeeded their deserving. He shook their hands at frequent public receptions in the White House. He attended the theater, a form of relaxation which kept him still within their view. He drove or rode almost daily through the spoke-like streets of the hive-dense city, returning the looks and salutes of men and women and children along the way. Thousands touched him, heard him, saw him at close range, and scarcely one in all those thousands ever forgot the sight of that tall figure, made taller still by the stovepipe hat and the homely drape of the shawl across the shoulders. Never forgotten because it was unforgettable, the impression remained incredible and enduring, imperishable in its singularity, and finally dear. In short, Lincoln's odd appearance and gracious, gentle manner became enduringly compelling. Many people got a look at Lincoln through his widely distributed photograph. Maybe this was not advantageous. The Paris correspondent of the New York Times said he looked like a condemned murderer of servant girls, and that such a face is enough to ruin the best of causes. However, people's need for a charismatic hero led many to convince themselves that his face revealed inspiring heroic qualities. A young soldier wrote after a Lincoln visit to the front, "None of us to our dying day can forget that countenance. Concentrated in that one great, strong, yet tender face, the agony of the life and death struggle of the hour was revealed as we had never seen it before. With a new understanding, we knew why we were soldiers." Thus, Lincoln's appearance at a distance and close up had an inspiring effect. It made charisma happen. Lincoln not only let people see him and on occasion touch him, as in Richmond on April 4th, 1865, he worked to make an emotional connection with his words, spoken or written. Today, those words can be read, but many have more impact when recorded by a Sam Waterston or enacted by a Daniel Day-Lewis. Furthermore, people reading Lincoln's words may imagine him writing or speaking them, perhaps thereby adding both to their emotional and to their intellectual impact. Still, it is the words themselves that move most people. What is it about those words that give them such power? One element is Lincoln's use of biblical imagery or scriptural allusion. Sometimes the use of biblical language is quite direct. Sometimes Lincoln simply nods to passages from the Bible. Such language allowed Lincoln to use rhythms and wordings that would have been familiar to large and diverse audiences. For example, in a famous 1858 speech, Lincoln memorably argued, "The house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free." The house divided metaphor might have had impact by itself, but surely its biblical origins gave it additional power. In Matthew 3:25, Jesus warns, "And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand." The second inaugural address adorns the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It is widely regarded as Lincoln's greatest speech. Toward the end, Lincoln turns to the Bible and to God and suggests the role of the divine in both starting and potentially ending the Civil War. He discusses prayer and includes both direct biblical quotations and allusions to biblical passages. His audience would be familiar with both. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. Here Lincoln refers to both Old and New Testaments. Bread from the sweat of other men's faces touches base with Genesis 3:19. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Well, let us judge not that we be not judged is Matthew 7:1. After quoting from Matthew again, woe unto the world because of offenses, and speculating that God gives to both North and South this terrible war as woe due to those by whom the offense came, Lincoln continues, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. These last words quote Psalms 19:9. Interestingly, Lincoln takes a different attitude toward divine power in his speech than he had in earlier ones. He doesn't claim as much knowledge of God's will as before. I'm skipping here. and let me just say that toward the end, Lincoln expresses more doubt about God's will than he had in his earlier speeches. And the final quotation, the beginning of the final sentence, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives to see the right. Lincoln is not claiming as much access to God's will as he had earlier. At the time, Lincoln's appearance, voice, and demeanor may have added to the charismatic reaction. Now only the words, the photographs, and the interpretations of numerous readers and actors shape our response. I have to leave some stuff. Michael? Gary, you've got the first.
Thank you, Alan. Ironically, I'm also going to be speaking, as will Tom, about Lincoln. Mine's three parts. It's Lincoln, the man, the car, and the tunnel. No, I will not be speaking about Lincoln. I want to thank Jepson and congratulate them. 20 years, it's a long time. And their School of Leadership Studies is at the vanguard. And I've titled my remarks, as brief as they are, if you are not schizophrenic, you're just not thinking clearly. Because we in leadership studies have every right to be schizophrenic, at least a little bit. And so let me explain. My own journey into leadership studies came from a midterm correction. I started out as a trained political scientist. I still practice the art and craft and science of politics. But about mid-career, I did a retooling, and I think you know how retooling can be very painful. And I did that painful process by having to confront my original training as a scientist. And I remember the first day I was in graduate school, I had a course in international politics from James Rosenau, one of the big names in the field, superstar in the field. And I remember the entire class, I remember the one thing we kept on doing, which was arguing. I kept on arguing, obviously, naively, that leaders mattered in international affairs and foreign policy decision-making. And he insisted that they don't matter, and that my grade depended on my believing that. But he kept on insisting, no, you're a political scientist. Damn it, a political scientist. And for political scientists, leadership matters very little. Well, over the years, I started to make the transition, and in part this was because of my association with Cronin, who had a lot of influence and still has a lot of influence over the way I think about things. I started opening up my sights a little bit more and started thinking more about leadership in general and more generically. Leadership studies begins almost at the other end of the spectrum from where political science begins. To leadership studies scholars, leadership matters, leaders matter. We wouldn't be here if they didn't, or at least if we thought they didn't. So I want to just ask, in those 20 years that Jepson's been in existence, a lot has happened, but how much has changed? Are we today still doing much the same thing we did 20 years ago? Only with more outlets for publication, a larger critical mass of scholars, international conferences, international associations. We're bigger, but are we better? And if so, how much better? And how do we measure that? And I want to briefly talk about three areas of importance, at least to me. And the first is teaching, then scholarship, then practice. In teaching, as the discussion today reminds us, The best works, the most effective works, the ones we keep coming back to in leadership studies are the classics. How many people in here have talked about Shakespeare? How many people have talked about Plato, Plutarch, Thucydides, Augustine, Machiavelli? These are the great thinkers who informed us, who raised the right questions, whose words we keep coming back to. That is not to be overly critical of the contemporary scholarship, because we've done a lot of great work. And yet, I teach with Plutarch. And I ask my students to read Plutarch's Lives of the Great Greeks and Romans. They're asking the right questions, they're raising the right issues. And so, in terms of scholarship, how much further beyond the classics have we gone? In terms of practice, the practice of leadership is part of our job to help make for better leaders out there. We'll know we've arrived when the following line is uttered in a Hollywood film. The scene is in a crowded, busy office, people running around all over the place. Zoom in on the boss, who yells out, "Damn it, go out there and find me a leadership scholar." What have we contributed to the practice of leadership? Yes, we have executive coaching, and I think that's quite good, and I do a little of it myself. We have management consultants, and some of those people are good and they do some good work. But in the bigger picture, to what extent have we had a significant or measurable impact on the practice of leadership? And is that even our job? And then finally, on scholarship. We still have no grand theory of leadership. Several people in this room made a great effort at it. Congratulations. Maybe we can't do it. Maybe we can't find one. Maybe one does not exist. We still have blurry definitional lines about what we study. I actually think the lines are much less blurry than we keep telling each other they are. I think we're okay on that area. But we keep on complaining that we don't have an agreed upon definition of the thing we study. But the real problem is that we are so multidisciplinary, so interdisciplinary. We cover so much intellectual territory that it's almost like speaking in foreign tongues, because you have the social scientist here, you've got the historian, you've got the philosopher, you've got this, the neuroscientist, you've got the study of what we do is so unbelievably complex, so unbelievably interrelated, interdisciplinary, that we can't master it. And therefore, if we're going to advance, we need to become a true community of scholars. We've got to lift each other up, because no one of us can do it. And so if we were to give a status report here 20 years into Jepson's history, what would it look like? It would suggest that we are a field and not a discipline. And in thinking back on the 20 years of the Jepson history, I think there's a lot of room to be hopeful and some room to be disappointed. So let me leave you with 4 questions about our field and where it is now and where it might be going. The first question I would ask is leadership so ubiquitous, so multi- and cross-disciplinary that it's too big as a field for us to study? Is it impossible to know, impossible to teach? How can we do so with precision? So big, so broad, does it hold meaning? The second question I would throw out is, can social science, my discipline, really study leadership? Or is it going to be relegated to cases, to biographies like Plutarch, to art like Shakespeare? Is there a better route to understanding leadership than social science? The third question I would ask is, what have we all contributed to the teaching, scholarship, and practice of leadership? What's the value added with all the work we do? And finally, and I'll answer this yes to begin with, is a broad, rigorous, disciplined, demanding liberal arts education the best preparation, the best training for leadership, or is more focused, more specialized education, specialized training the answer? Let me give 2 cheers for liberal arts. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I want to talk today about something a bit off the beaten path. I want to talk to you about music and leadership. I have, for 30-something years, studied and written about institutional political leadership, presidents, judges, justices, those kinds of things, even founding fathers, so forth. And recently I've decided to turn back to a long-standing interest of mine, and that was the importance of music as a means of leadership and what I call the cultural transmission of political and moral sentiments. Having taught courses on Lincoln and John Marshall and James Madison and Pericles and so forth, I've decided to do this both in the classroom and undertake a major research project on the power of music to facilitate leadership and what that means. As I was thinking about talking about this afternoon, and knowing my friend Don Forsythe was going to be here screaming zero, I was reminded of Locke's self-admonition when he was publishing the essay concerning human understanding. And in Book 3, he says, "What I've got here is something new, but something a little out of the way." And it occurred to me, I might very well think this is new, and you might very well think this is a little out of the way. But what I'd like to talk about is why I've undertaken to do this, and what I see as the purposes of doing a course on music and leadership studies. And the course I teach is folk music and American protest thought. We start with the Carter family and end with Bob Dylan. Actually, we end with Hazel Dickens. But the project that I'm undertaking more broadly, in scholarly terms, is a project that takes its point of departure from a simple and obvious premise, and that is that most people, most of the time, do not get their political inclinations or their moral sentiments from the great tracts and treatises. And the reason for that, as John Locke put it in the essay, is that the greatest part of men, having much to do to get the means of their living, are not in a condition to look after those learned and laborious inquiries. Rather, their time is spent trying, he said, to still the croaking of their own bellies or the cries of their children. Thus, it seemed to me, it's very clear in philosophic terms that there are other avenues that allow for the cultural transmission of moral and political sentiments, and it struck me that not least among those is music. One of the great advantages of being at the Jepson School is if you undertake to do this, you have people that know something about it. I have my social psychologists who can tell me about the emotions of music and how that affects them. I have Terry Price, who's one of the great guitar pickers in Richmond. If you didn't know that, you ought to get him to come out later tonight and play for you. Just wanted to head you off right there. But I began to read through some of the literature, and I was struck by how strong the emotional response music can spawn can actually be. A response, as one scholar put it, is often deeper than reason. And sufficiently strong to elicit what Adam Smith would call natural sympathy among men. Among the people that it gives rise to, there's abiding a sense of fellow feeling. That is to say, the ability to put ourselves in another's place. The ability allows us to imagine the joys and the sorrows of others, of our fellows, going even so far as to imagine, as Adam Smith put it, that awful futurity of death itself. Thus, it seems to me that the power to generate a common feeling about matters good and bad, right and wrong, is what gives music its social and political influence. In my class, I take two approaches to how to teach this folk music, body of folk music. Two approaches of it to make sense of it for a leadership studies program, which if you think other classes elicit the response, why is this in leadership studies? Forget Augustine. Try Woody Guthrie. The first is to understand the power of cultural transformation in its broadest sense, and that is to say we take a look at those figures that are the most important in the history of music, those without whom American musical culture would not be what it is. As I say, the Carter family, Bob Dylan, Bill Monroe, people like that. But the second is what interests me the most, and that is an examination of the cultural means to political ends. And that is, what is it about music that enables somebody to convey political sentiments, political views, and convince people to go along? And what is it about the power of that? And if you go back and dust off your youthful experiences with the folk revival, though some of us lived through it, you understand a little bit about what I'm getting at, and that is the ability to convey to people fellow feeling, sentiment that matters, and bring them along with you. If you think back to Woody Guthrie and the Union movement, Bob Dylan and the anti-war, the civil rights movement, the very fact that Martin Luther King saw fit to take Joan Baez with him to sing "We Shall Overcome," the fact that Pete Seeger was hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, There's a lot of evidence that politics infuse folk music and do so in a very deliberate way. The thing I want to conclude with, and these are the best words you've heard all afternoon, the last of a long day. In conclusion, I wanted to leave you with two quotations from Woody Guthrie, who, it seems to me, epigraphically is my point of departure, these two sentiments. First, he writes this: civilization is spread more by singing than anything else, because whole big bunches can sing a particular song where not every man can join in on the conversation. A song ain't nothing but a conversation fixed up to where you can talk it over and over without getting tired of it. And it's this repeating the idea over and over that makes it take a hold, always a hold. If the conversation is about good crops are bad, good politics are bad, good news are bad, good anything else are bad, the best way to circulate it amongst the people is by singing it. And then in 1941, he wrote to the Almanac Singers, one of his group of fellow travelers of the day in the folk music world, and he had this to say to them: "Our job ain't so much to go way back into history. That already has been done, and we can't spare the time to do it all over again. Our job is the here and now, today, this week, this month, this year. But we've got to try and include a timeless element in our songs. Something that will not tomorrow be gone with the wind, but something that tomorrow will be as true as it is today. The secret of a lasting song is not the recorded current event, but this timeless element which may be contained in the chorus or the last line or elsewhere." And it's this combination of the idea of repeating the ideas, the sentiments, this timeless element that can convey an understanding of what a direction you should move into as a society. And it seems to me that if we look at music as a means of understanding leadership, we have everything in one place. The relationship between leader and follower. I mean, what's a folk singer without an audience, right? That the ability to spread sentiments of a political and moral nature becomes quite easily understood by those who are listening to these people in ways that it may not be easily understood if you repair to the great treatises of Hobbes or Spinoza. And in that, I promise, I conclude.
It's so nice to be back at Jepson, see so many people I know, and to see how strong and centered you all are. And the new faculty is great to see new faculty here bringing new light. I'm going to take sort of Gary's license and talk a little bit about new horizons, new creativity. You know, I guess it was 21 years ago I wrote The Intellectual History of Leadership Studies. It was a paper I wrote for American Political Science Association, and Tom Cronin was the chair of that. And it was 21 years ago. And I was thinking, have things changed since then? And I guess the major way I think things have changed is that our field has become much more legitimate in our institutions. It's still hard if you're a solo person somewhere, you know, trying to convince the provost or something. That's still hard. But mostly, because of the work that Jepson and others have done so many years ago, it's a lot easier than it was. So I think that's a real big step. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, I get bored. I'm sort of bored with leadership, to be perfectly honest. So as a firstborn, you know, someone once told me I like to jump into the pool first to tell everybody, come on in, the water's fine. I'm sort of like that. And sometimes I jump in the water and it's a big mess, you know, or there's rocks or something. And other times it's, you know, it's something I can inspire others to get involved in. But because I've been kind of bored with leadership studies for whatever reason, I decided to go out into the marketplace, into the field, and to figure out, you know, what's happening with leadership, where the rubber meets the road. So I want to talk about just 4 or 5 different scenarios. One is, some of you know this, I was the inaugural chair of transformation for the U.S. Army, and Donald Rumsfeld appointed me. And I went to the Army War College for a year, and I discovered almost as soon as I got there that their definition of transformation was to merge the services together, that they really weren't very interested in leadership, you know, but they needed the services to work more closely together instead of being competitive, you know, the Army versus the Navy and so forth. So I said, okay, I'm just sort of going to relax here, you know, I've got a year, I've got to figure out what to do. Of course, one of the reasons I wanted to go to the Army was that the Army was the first institution in this country that began the study of leadership, you know, back in World War II when General Eisenhower funded a great deal of research. Then he became the superintendent of West Point. They created the first Department of Leadership Studies, and Howard Prince was the chair of that, blah, blah, blah. Howard Prince was the dean here, et cetera. So the Army has been really, really at the forefront of many, many aspects of leadership education and leadership research. Another reason for that is that in times of war, we give tremendous amount of money to the Army and the Navy and so forth to study leadership, because we want to study, leadership and followership and teamwork. How do you get guys to go out in the field, now it's women too, and stay there? What happens when a person has had all their limbs shot off? They want to go back to the battlefield to be with their buddies. How do you train someone to want that? And the Army knows how to do it, good or bad. They know a lot about it. And they get millions and millions of dollars at the Army Research Center. So when I was at the War College, some of the things they were studying was to teach soldiers how to fight the battlefield of the mind. That basically they were saying, don't shoot what's in front of you, but be in a collaborative, co-creative experience with the battlefield and fight that battle. So the mental models, which sounds a little scary to me, but they definitely were doing that work. And others were things like swarming. How do you have the best, swarms are robotic and human teams. And there are now a lot of robotic and human teams. And so how to work effectively in a swarm. Those are some of the, of course, they have their big war games, and they have their video games that are unbelievable in terms of leadership and followership. So they have really cutting edge stuff there. And that resulted in a book called The General's Art. I wrote about strategic leadership. So there's a lot to learn from the Army. Then I went about working with transplant surgeons. I worked with a team that recently, about 6 or 7 months ago, did the facial transplant in Baltimore, in which 114 surgeons worked collaboratively as a team over 2 days to completely reconstruct. And these were plastic surgeons, they were dental surgeons, they were transplant surgeons, and so forth, to completely reconstruct this man's face. And it was a wonderful outcome. But what was really interesting for me was to work with a team of surgeons. More about that later, maybe. I also worked a bit with Cesar Millan, who was the dog whisperer, and I wrote a story for him, a storyboard of a show. But I also learned a lot about being calm and assertive, and how to take up my assertive A personality, which I never really had in real life, but you have to be that way if you have bull terriers. So it's definitely something to learn. There's a lot to learn there. And then I went to the law school, University of Maryland Law School, where I'm working, because I'm really interested in the professions. How does this all get played out in the professions? And we just finished a book, Leadership in Law, which came out last week, actually, about how to teach leadership in law schools. But, lawyers are kind of an interesting lot, because their communities, once they get out there, they look at them as leaders. They want to put them on boards, they want to seek their advice about things. Half of members of Congress, slightly half now, are lawyers. So it's our perception of lawyers that they are leader-like, but actually, in point of fact, most lawyers don't feel very leader-like. They're very risk-averse. Have you ever asked a lawyer if you can do something in university? Well, I have. What they say is, I'd rather you wouldn't. Okay? So ask a lawyer whether you could do something in university. They always say, I'd rather you wouldn't. And so finally I stopped asking, right? And just sort of did it. And mostly, they just cleaned up the mess after me. There was nothing else they could do. So at any rate, lawyer leaders is an interesting problem, because not all lawyers want to take up leadership yet. They're seen as leaders. And I guess I've been there 3 or 4 years, and I love the students. And I've had many Jepson students, or at least 3 or 4 Jepson students in my class, which is really rewarding. Gil and I wrote this book on visible leadership, which is studied award-winning companies picked by World Blue, which is a blue ribbon kind of organization that picks democratic workplaces. And with the help of Don, thank you, I haven't got to tell you personally because everyone's always talking to you, and Kathy and Crystal and Terry, we were able to do a quantitative study of these companies and begin to boil out some of the truths, and it was very, very interesting in the sense of we found that companies that had high-purpose organizations, had high purpose, they drew people to apply to them. They had more applicants. The people who came stayed longer, they expressed more satisfaction, and they were more effective and made more money. Now, we could have probably guessed that, right? You know, if you have an organization like that. But at any rate, it was nice to kind of go through the discipline. Thank you, Bruce Abolio, who actually pushed Gil and I into doing that. It was very interesting to see that. Also, Ron and I have been working on a series for Routledge on leadership and practice, and several of you, the authors here, but I'd love to talk to you about that, because, you know, it's a collection of people that are writing not only about leadership, but about practice, which I think is really important. I guess my last thought I was going to tell you about, well, those of you who know me, I sort of like to have fun too, because I get bored, right? And so I was invited to meet with, I was going to tell you to turn the tape off. You want to turn your tape off? Yeah, you can turn your tape off about this. I really don't want this all over the world, because it's kind of...
Leadership Studies comrades. I like that phrase this morning. I too want to join the chorus of people thanking Jepson School, and particularly Rich, because Rich was really here before anyone, and Rich deserves a hell of a lot of credit, I think, for engaging in one of the boldest experiments you can have at a liberal arts college or liberal arts undergraduate program of launching this, because there were a lot of people saying it couldn't be done, and there were a lot of people here who were not particularly welcoming of it, and Rich really was indispensable in making this happen. And I've had a chance to watch it over the 21 or 2 year period or whatever it is, and I've been so impressed, particularly when I've met the students who've graduated from the program, and also seen the outpouring of research that has come out in a whole variety of ways, not only through the professions, but and conferences like this, very valuable. So Dean and Chancellor, congratulations, as well as the faculty. My discussion is going to be, I asked to come last because I thought it would be a pre-cocktail party talk, and I have a bunch of random thoughts on the movie Abraham Lincoln, filmed here in town 15 months ago, and in Petersburg, 20 miles south. And Lincoln's parents were born in Virginia, it turns out. He spent one of the last 3 weeks of his life here in Greater Richmond. And in fact, as I think Al mentioned, he came 2 days after Jefferson Davis left town, and he actually came in with a small escort and sat in Jefferson Davis's chair, absolutely, which is not in the movie, but it's a remarkable vignette. I mean, imagine that occurring on the world scene today somewhere. But the movie by Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner will be watched and form leadership images much more than, I'm sorry to say, all of our readings combined over the next decade. It is an enormously profitable movie. It is historically inspired, but historically flawed. And historians are having a field day puncturing this, that, or the other thing. And we need to, from the get-go, understand it's not a documentary, and it's full of made-up, entertaining stories, and it will lead some of you, like our friend Barbara Kellerman, to walk out. And Barbara told me before lunch she walked out of the movie.
Well, that was between you and me. To turn the camera off.
But I have had a few students who are English majors or into film studies who give it a B-. But it's going to win a lot of awards. It's been nominated for 12 Oscars. Spielberg is a fascinating story. He tried to get into film school, couldn't get in. He was turned down. It's one of the classic American stories of so many writers and people who've turned out into great careers. He was turned down by a whole bunch of film schools, finally snuck in, I think, to Long Beach State and dropped out of that after a while. He's now worth between $3 and $4 billion. And if you think about his movies, which include Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan and E.T. and Indiana Jones, and it's a list. I've only seen a few of them. Enormously impressive, and every film he does, he wins an award for. And then Daniel Day-Lewis is fascinating. He was not on my horizon until I saw the movie There Shall Be Blood. And what's interesting about him is he's going to win Everybody knows this. He's going to win the Best Actor award. It's already a done deal of 6 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever it is in advance. And he probably deserves it. He's a method actor's method actor. And it's rumored that he read, I can't believe this, and Al and Gary probably are in this category, but it's rumored that he's read 500 books on Lincoln to prepare himself, and which is incredible. I think I've read maybe 20, but 500 books? And the other thing that's marvelous about his performance is that he's an Englishman. He actually has English and Irish citizenship, and I interviewed a few people on the plane coming into Richmond last night about whether they noticed any accent, and one person said, no, I didn't hear any accent, and another person said, I think it was Midwestern. I couldn't tell an accent, and I saw the movie twice, and learned only 2 or 3 days ago that he is not only an Englishman, but a famous English family. His father was a noted poet, and family, very important family, and honored family in many respects. Fascinating performance. And that alone is worth going to it. The movie will upset leadership scholars because it's a great person theory movie, in large part, but not completely. And what I want to spend most of my time on is just 4 or 5 thoughts about making this movie, because most of our students will see it. I assume only about half of you all have seen it because it's only been out 7 or 8 weeks. It's already made its money back. $200 million has been made back within 10 weeks of its, it was maybe a low budget movie because they used Richmond for their set. I don't know, like, apparently they took up several blocks of downtown and the state capitol where a lot of it was filmed. But just a few random thoughts. First of all, Lincoln holds an unusual place in American political ideology and American popular culture. He is the president. Virtually every survey that's thoughtfully done, he comes out number 1. So you have a fabulous director, a fabulous actor, John Williams, a fabulous composer, Tony Kushner, a fabulous writer, and how about throwing in a fabulous president, the 16th president of the United States. It's a prequel to West Wing. There was no West Wing, so you had to wait 42 more years before there would be physically West Wing. Anyways, it was filmed here rather than in the White House. But Lincoln's role in American mythology is amazing. The film that many of us saw when we were younger, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jefferson Davis, the accidental president from some nameless Midwestern state, comes to Washington, D.C., and he's fighting the machines, he's fighting corruption, a terribly un-American U.S. Senate. What does he do for inspiration? He goes to visit Memorial, and there's a famous scene there in the film, and he says, that's Lincoln Memorial. Gee whiz, Mr. Lincoln, there he is. He's just looking straight out at you as you come up the steps. Just Mr. Lincoln was waiting. He was waiting for somebody. To which Senator Smith's secretary said, yes, Jeff, he was waiting for you. And thus inspired, Senator Smith goes back to fight the dragons and the villains. One reviewer has pointed out that Lincoln, in order to get the 13th Amendment passed, which is the core of this film, had to use the techniques of the people who were fighting Jefferson Smith in order to get the 13th Amendment through. So there's an irony that along those lines. Richard Hofstadter, whose wonderful book, The American Political Tradition, that many of us read in high school years ago, wrote, the Lincoln legend has come to have a hold on the American imagination that defies comparison with anything else in political mythology. Here is drama in which a great man shoulders the torment and moral burdens of a blundering and sinful people and suffers for them and redeems them with the hallowed Christian virtues, malice towards none, charity for all, and is destroyed at the pitch of his success. And then Clinton Rossiter, one of my favorite quotes in Clinton Rossiter's best-selling, it was the best-selling book for 20 years, called The American Presidency. Rossiter says, Lincoln is the supreme myth, the richest symbol in the American experience. He is, as someone has remarked, neither irreverently nor sacrilegiously, the martyred Christ of democracy's passion play. 1 minute. Wow. And who then, goes on to say, who can measure what it means to live in Lincoln's house and room and so on. 3 or 4 quick thoughts about the film. Number one contribution the film makes is that Lincoln had to become a politician in order to get the 13th Amendment passed. And it shows him lying to his Secretary of State, lying to Congress, bribing. It doesn't say this in the film, but it's in all the literature. He had to sell some ambassadorships. He also had to do something through lobbyists to get 8 people, 8 Democrats, most of them lame term Democrats, to not show up. And so Lincoln, the great emancipator, becomes a little bit the great manipulator. In addition to Saint Abraham or Father Abraham, you have in the film Tammany Abe, or Abe the boss, if you will. And that's an important contribution. There are 5 or 6 other important ideas I want to suggest about how this movie can be used as a teaching moment, if you will, since, whether we like it or not, it's going to be seen by, if you teach undergraduates like I do, it will be seen in large part. The only final thing I'll use, even though I don't have the time, is that what fascinates me, as I alluded to this morning, is that Lincoln was not out front on black equality or black voting rights or even the Emancipation Proclamation. Or he had to be pushed by women's groups, black groups, abolition groups, and all kinds of groups in order for him to step up and to be a leader. So it's an absolutely fascinating case of when does he become, and this goes back to one of the grand paradoxes Jim Burns often talked to us about, is when do you know when a follower has become a leader? And you know, that magical moment, it comes quite late. I mean, he's 55 or 54 years old, and a year or two before he dies, before he really gets to be the leader that we now want to remember, and the hero that we want to have serve our purposes. So it is a fascinating set of, there's a whole other set about Lincoln as the seedbed of the imperial presidency. He had 13,000 people arrested, including a third of the Maryland state legislature. He violated habeas corpus rights unconstitutionally. He did all kinds of things that we forgive him for because we like the outcome, and to some extent he was humble about it in many ways. This is an important movie, and it's a movie our students will see, and I urge you to think through a whole panoply of ethical questions and political questions. It's also a wonderful example of the Marx Weber essay, Politics as Vocation, in which you have in this film the ethic of ultimate ends clashing with the ethic of responsibility, and somehow Lincoln comes through in the end, and how somehow balances and merges these Max Weberian kinds of tensions that all leaders everywhere have to kind of balance and juggle day in, day out. Thank you.
I guess we open up to your questions now.
Comments? Do you think Lincoln, the film Lincoln has juiced up Obama?
Excuse me?
Do you think the film Lincoln has juiced up Obama?
I think it has a little bit. To some extent, it's a memo to George W. Bush and Obama to not be too transcending and too rhetorical. But you know, I think they very carefully, as somebody else pointed out, kept it until after the elections to put out. But I think, and Spielberg is well known as a big Democratic supporter. Right. He did support Governor Schwarzenegger for governor of California. Otherwise, he actually supported Hillary Clinton in the 07-08 campaign. He's a very close friend with Clinton and is a big contributor to the Democratic Party. I don't think he wanted to overtly, explicitly send a message to Washington. But the message of the film, and if you have a chance to discuss it with students, is that you cannot be an effective American president unless you are political. And we don't remember Lincoln as a politician nowadays. The fact is, he was a politician to the core. Politics was his life from age 23 years old on. He was in and out of office all his life. He was a member of the Whig Party, the Republican Party leader, and then the final analysis, the Union Party in 1864. But he lived and breathed politics. And this brings out in an honorable way. Several historians like Sean Willens, an excellent review in the New Republic, December 31st, and David Brooks in the New York Times, have said the greatness of this film is that it brings honor to politics. And it puts, I think Joe Klein of the New York Time magazine put it, this is a nice bouquet to the reality that you need to have some grease in order to make the political process work. And that Lincoln gradually, slowly, he was passive so often in his life. He was a great listener, but to some extent he was a listener that if you were an abolitionist or a Frederick Douglass, you would have been infuriated. By the way, PBS, the same month, or last month, a month after the Lincoln movie came out, PBS did a wonderful 3-part series of American Experience on the abolitionists. And if you watch that 3 hours, I think it was on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks in a row, Lincoln's a scoundrel, and Lincoln's AWOL when it comes to moral leadership. And so if you show in these stage and screen types of courses the Spielberg film we're talking about, because people have already seen it, you have them see that 3-part on the abolitionists. Now, they do the reverse thing. They're overly reverential to William Lloyd Garrison, Harvey, Stowe, and people who, it's like a pain in the ass to Lincoln. But only by a whole variety of these things would you be able to really get at what leadership was. There should be also a movie about Stephen Douglas. Because had Stephen Douglas and not Lincoln won, maybe the Civil War wouldn't have occurred. My final thought is that, to some extent, Spielberg has a happy ending. The 13th Amendment passes, and there's celebrations. But in a way, he dies, 700,000 people died in the Civil War, and a horrendous reconstruction is just about to begin.